In this edition of If Explains, listen to Insight Forward CEO Ross Hill and Chief Geopolitical Officer Dr. Treston Wheat discuss the polarization of domestic markets.
We see that sort of rise in nationalism, the differing of kind of opinion in how people feel like domestic policy is going versus what is happening. And that's sort of difficult for companies to kind of navigate as well. We start to see the polarization in the population directly impacting consumer choice, and actually choosing to buy products or services from a company because people feel like there's shared values there, not just about because they think you've got the best product or service anymore. And there are kind of many examples, we've seen recently of that, both, I think, domestically is quite pronounced probably more pronounced in the US, I would say, than I've seen across Europe. But also there are geopolitical things occurring that are having the same, effect as well as that.
hmm Yeah, and so I agree with you that the U.S. market is increasingly polarized, and I think it's related to our discussion of like the rise of nationalism. Politics is changing, and people are becoming more hardened on their views because for example, the nationalists or right-wing populists are rejecting wholesale liberal values. We use the term illiberalism, and illiberalism isn't necessarily authoritarianism, but a rejection of what we have understood for the last 200 years of a liberal society. And so that has led to this sort of hardening. And then you see the rise of also sort of postmodern liberalism that takes a similar attitude as the right-wing populists. And we see this from the survey data where people no longer just view their political opposition as, oh, they have just slightly different values than me, or they interpret data differently than me. We actually see that they hate each other. They believe if you
Yeah.
disagree with me, you are morally repugnant. We see this from all kinds of surveys, and then we see like a rise of the risk of political violence because of this. The polling shows, the surveys show a significant increase in the use of violence to secure the interests of your community, basically. And so corporations have had to face major reputational issues when they enter those like political
Mm.
discussions. The most obvious example, but it's still so salient, is the Bud Light, where Dylan Mulvaney, a trans influencer, held up a specialized can of Bud Light, and right-wing critics went crazy and started boycotting the company, and it actually worked. And so this was the reason
Mm.
it's salient is boycotts overwhelmingly don't work, but they might actually increasingly work now. So Bud Light was an easier boycott because they had alternatives, Coors Light, Modelo, and so their sales dropped 25% and haven't recovered. But polarization may actually make boycotts more effective because you're going to be willing to sacrifice and not purchase products or services if you are ideologically opposed. And so this is where we're seeing the major concern is corporations choosing to try and navigate this polarization. Even if, and this is the difficult and ironic part of it, you may also be punished for not being like openly political and openly
Mm.
supportive. And
Yeah.
so it's going to be a very difficult needle to thread, and corporations will probably have to make choices of how they want to do this. What is their consumer base? What is a possible consumer base? How penetrated are they into the market, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, geopolitically, things like the Russia-Ukraine conflict first, and the companies that were slow to leave the Russian market after Russia invaded Ukraine were heavily criticized. Um, despite kind of some saying, well, we're a food producer, this directly affects the people in Russia if we were to leave. It's not as
Mhm.
simple as just like dumping everything and exiting the market. And then that followed with also, the Israel Hamas conflict, again with people making comments, either pro-Israeli or anti-Israeli comments, or pro-Palestinian comments, however you want to describe those, actually kind of receiving kind of threats because of the comments they made about that war. And so a lot happens domestically, of course, but can't forget how you respond to different things going on in the world will also impact how you're perceived in your particular market, or how you're perceived by your consumers or your clients.
And not just the market, by the way, employees.
Yes, good point. Good point.
Problem with polarization. We saw like employee protests over the Israel-Palestine issue. Google ended up firing like 50 people over this particular problem of employee activism and protests. And so polarization is actually creating insider threats for corporations that they didn't necessarily have to contend with before.
Yeah, and I know something you pointed out in the past is looking at the large student protests that we saw that were anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, however you want to describe that. Those students, a lot of them are now entering the workforce. So I think it's kind of, obviously people do change and their opinions change, but it's reasonable to assume that some of them will take those viewpoints into the workforce as well. So again, people's own personal politics are much more pronounced in the workforce than they used to be. I think the workplace used to be kind of like politically neutral. I don't think we can really necessarily say that's exactly the same now.
Yeah, I don't think it's politically neutral at all anymore. And that's exactly what we're talking about as well, is because corporations are now so connected with political issues, the work space is now political as well, for good or ill. Again, because this could relate to corporate values or interests, a whole sort of thing. But we do have to recognize the potential threats or disruptions that can actually come from this as well.
Yeah. Well, of course, a number of companies have actually been very successful in positioning themselves, as a particular or promote themselves to a particular group in a particular market, on one political side or the other. It's not just on any one side. So there are, like you say, there is opportunity within that as well, depending on kind of how you want to position yourself.
Coffee companies, I think, is such a great example of exactly what you're talking about. We have the liberal coffee companies and we have the conservative coffee companies. Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. I wasn't going to name any names there. Okay, so that polarization, the nationalism, political instability, and all those other geopolitical forces, we do think that this is creating now, direct physical security risks for corporations.